Love Yours, an experimental podcast. Welcome back to another episode of Love Yours. I'm your host, Charlotte Tahira, and this season we are talking finances with Selina Flavius's book, Black Girl Finance, Let's Talk Money. And we are on chapter 8, Building an Emergency Fund. Now, I was so happy with my pot. I had saved almost £5,000. As I mentioned on the previous episode, unfortunately, I had to keep dipping into it to support my family. And then, in a very low moment in my life, crashed my car. And that temporary moment cost me £3,000 to replace it. So since then, I've been struggling to build back up that emergency fund. I've managed to get it to 1k, but for me, that's nothing because just my tax for the year and my insurance is around that price. Luckily, my mum has stepped in recent times to give me a float until payday, but it also means that month to month I'm having to keep such a close eye on my finances, and it's taken away the freedom to do the things I want. Also, after living independently for such a long time, I feel a lot of guilt, and I don't like asking my mum to be my golden parachute or whatever the saying is. In fact, I wouldn't even ask my mum for money. She just knows I'm struggling and so will just transfer me the money depending on what it's for. So in this chapter, Selina talks about when thinking of savings and your emergency fund, it's about your mindset. Don't tell yourself you can't afford to save. Even though I do that daily. I feel like I can't afford to save, but no matter what, every month £50 goes into my ISA. And I guess that starts to build, and that is my emergency fund, because although it's being paid into an ISA, I can access that money with 5 days notice if I need to. And to be honest, that emergency fund has saved me. I needed some legal fees this year. Also, when I had to replace my car. Even when I was travelling and I needed a cushion to keep me until payday. I also have a savings account, but it's way too easy to access. I can transfer money in seconds. So I need to take Selina's advice to open a savings account with a different bank. Because honestly, having that emergency fund is real, especially once you become a parent. And I'm not going to exaggerate, like a child's financial emergency is not going to be that expensive. It may be that they need new trainers or, something for their health. But generally, their week-to-week expenses aren't that high in compared to an adult emergency. If your car goes, if your boiler goes, we talked about this on the last episode, having that emergency fund will stop you having to take out another loan or rack up more credit card debt, because it means you'll be able to pay then and there for that emergency. She also talks about if you get any lump sums that are significant, that aren't connected to your monthly budget, what to do with that. And it's good timing because my company has just started doing bonuses, annual bonuses. So I'll definitely get one of those this year. And that's the type of money that you could easily decide, you know what? I've worked really hard this year. I'm going to blow it on X, Y, or Z. Or you could go, do you know what? I'm going to put that into my emergency fund because that's not money I really accounted for. And so I don't need to spend it. Another tip she gives is obviously side hustles. Now, honestly, if you're like me, you have 2 young children under 5, you work a full-time job, you work a part-time job, you do not have time for a side hustle. But it did make me think about my residual income potential. If you've never heard of residual income, it's basically money that works for itself. It's money that works without you having to spend time. So, for example, renting out an online course. Renting out your car, because that's actually a thing now. People pay to rent your car. Things that will earn you money without you having to do anything. And without it having to cost you any time. So I definitely need to look into adding some marketing to my business on social media because that is an online training platform that could make me money while I sleep. A few years back, I recorded some training videos that are great for anyone who wants to get into radio or broadcasting, or even tips for artists on how to get more exposure and radio play. She also talks about once you've built up that emergency fund pot, when is it okay to access it? And she asks you to assess the level on a scale of 1 to 10. If that emergency is between a 7 and a 10, that is what the emergency fund is for. You know, it's interesting because it makes me think of my grandma, who has been saving her entire life. She came from very humble beginnings in Grenada, came to the UK to have a better life for herself, and so was obsessed with this need to save and create generational wealth, which has done her well so far. She owns her house in Shepherd's Bush. It's worth a lot of money. She's never worrying now. She's retired. She's in her 80s, so she retired in her 60s, and she's never had to worry month to month how she's going to cover her bills. She's managed to go on a few holidays. But ultimately, I feel like her emergency funds, she really gets an attitude about when she has to spend them. So, for example, she decided she wanted to refreshen up her kitchen and get it painted and the hallways. And obviously, she had to tap into her emergency fund, which is thousands, by the way. Like, she has a very good emergency fund pot. And that's not to say that, and that's where my money mindset comes in, isn't it? That's not to say that because she has a lot in her emergency fund, she must spend it. But she was really irritated and aggravated about having to spend it. And it's really interesting that we sometimes, and not so much me because I don't have that luxury, but sometimes we save and save and there's no actual direction or purpose of what we're saving for. And so I think it's really important to establish within yourself and within your money mindset what each pot is for. So you have your month-to-month expenses. You have your investing in your future savings, so towards your pension and retirement. And then you have your emergency fund. And ultimately, if you have to spend from your emergency fund, then that's exactly what it was there for. You shouldn't beat yourself up about having to use it because you were saving it for this sort of emergency. Remember, scale 7 to 10. And it comes back to an earlier episode where Selina stresses the importance of clearing your debts ahead of saving, because if you have an emergency fund, but you have a financial emergency, well, what are you going to do then? Pay for it on a credit card to save your emergency fund and then pay interest on top of it? So I'm really having to change my money mindset around a lot of areas of how I manage my finances, and building this emergency fund and forgiving myself and having compassion for myself for when unpredicted things happen and I have to spend it. Ultimately, that is what it's there for. And it plays into this episode's quote very well. So Mandy Woodruff Santos said, "We spend far too much time teaching women of colour to settle for stability and not enough time teaching them how to take strategic risks." And ultimately, spending your emergency funds on something that's an emergency is a strategic risk. Because even though you're impacting your emergency fund pot, it's much better for you to spend that money on this emergency than to avoid it and then have a bigger cost down the line, whether that's because you put it on a credit card or you got a loan for it, and now you're paying additional costs than what it would have actually cost if you just spent your emergency fund. It's weird to have a podcast about finances and to actually just talk about spending for a change. Every episode's been about saving or investing, you know. But I think we'll leave it there, and I definitely would challenge you to really think about your different pots of money and how much are in each, and to ensure that when you have these pots, you're not neglecting debt for them. And that's it for today's episode. So don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, share, comment, and I'll see you on the next one. Love yours. an experimental podcast.